Hello, this video is the Unit 4 review video. I'm going to be kind of looking at the key concepts and making notes on the side over here. So the first is the rise of political parties in the era of Jefferson. So the first historical development is talking about the early 1800s. There's national political parties that continued to debate issues such as the tariff powers of the federal government in relations with European powers. So if I were to make a comparison between the two political parties at the time, we have the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Federalists are people like Alexander Hamilton. Democratic Republicans are like Jefferson and Madison. And so they're going to debate different things. Some of the topics they have on there is the tariff. Federalists are pro-tariff, pro-business. Democratic Republicans are anti-tariffs. Federalists want a strong central government. Modeled after the British system. Democratic Republicans want strong state governments. And a weak central government. They were fine with the Articles of Confederation. Relations with European powers. The Federalists want to support trade with the British and have good relations with them. Democratic Republicans support relationship with France. And so we're going to have these two political parties debate what all these issues, including more like the National Bank. Okay. The next section also kind of goes with the Supreme Court decisions establishing the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution, asserted that federal laws took precedence over state laws. And so the Federalists are going to agree with Supreme Court that decide national supremacy. The Democratic Republicans are going to oppose Supreme Court. And so just a couple things about the Supreme Court. John Marshall is the first Chief Justice, and he follows a lot of the national supremacy rulings. McCulloch versus Maryland showed the supremacy of the national government over state governments. Basically, that national government could control interstate commerce. And Marbury versus Madison, which was the judicial review that gave the Supreme Court review power over national laws. Here, federal over state. And there's a couple others. Dartmouth versus Georgia. Last point on here is about the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was done by President Jefferson. Bought from France. So they explored this new land by Lewis and Clark, sent by President Jefferson. Looking for a Northwest Passage, hopefully an all-water route where you could take the Mississippi River and go to the Pacific Ocean, but this was not found. And so what we see coming into this early 1800s is fights between different sectional interests, or what's described here as regional interests. And so sectionalism leads to fights over slavery and economic policy. So you could talk about the Missouri Compromise, where they create a line. Any new states of the line would be free, and any below would be a slave state. Those regional interests are also going to disagree about tariff policy. The South is against tariffs because when there's tariffs, they either have to buy expensive foreign goods or buy from expensive northern sellers. That's why we see things like the tariff of abominations. The tariffs are one part of the American system that was supported by people like Henry Clay. So one, they had tariffs. Two, they believed in internal improvements. So that's like building a national road, building canals, usually in northern states. And then there is support for the national bank, which Southerners believed it primarily helped business interests in the North and not helping Southerners. So potentially this American system supports northern states. That's why southern states don't like it as much, and why economic policy is becoming sectionalized. We talked about the Missouri Compromise and how this was supposed to be seen as a way to avoid the slavery issue. In fact, it's going to make things worse. There's going to be more questions that continue on after it. On the world stage in the early 1800s, We talked about how the United States is growing in influence from Atlantic to Pacific through things like the Louisiana Purchase. But the biggest issue that they're going to want to control is the land that is in places like the Caribbean. And so the United States wants control over its own land and more influence in other areas like the Caribbean. And so it wants to get rid of European interests. And so with Monroe, he comes out with what's now called the Monroe Doctrine. The European countries to stay out of the Americas. The U.S.'s growing influence in the Americas also shows what it tries to do to American Indians. Ordered by President Jackson. American Indians were removed from southeastern states and placed in today's Oklahoma and other Great Plains states. Many people died. Some sued and were unsuccessful. So the market revolution comes about in the 1800s. So pre-1800, most people worked for themselves. If you were a producer, if you created things, like let's say you're a gun maker, you made your own gun and sold it. If a part of that gun broke, the buyer would have to come back to you to get it fixed. But when we get to the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution and now Market Revolution, now people began to work for others or other businesses. Businesses started using things like interchangeable parts, coined in America by Eli Whitney, which means that guns use the same parts, so consumers can go anywhere for repairs. But now people aren't their own boss anymore. They work outside the home. The manufacture and production of goods becomes more organized. Businesses are being run to produce this stuff. And more people are not working for themselves anymore. And so there's lots of new innovations, like textile machinery, steam engines, which is good for going up and down rivers. I mentioned interchangeable parts before. The telegraph, which is going to help communication. And agricultural inventions like the steel plow or the mechanical reaper machine. These are all going to help workers in factories. With all of this money being supporting roads, canals, and railroads, this leads to increased markets where people can travel up and down rivers and can trade things much further away, especially with steam engines and other inventions like that. Transportation networks like these canals, like these national roads, are going to make the North and the Midwest become more solidified, even though they're very different, more alike compared to the South. South is going to keep increasing cotton production, while the North focuses on banking, manufacturing, shipping. Now, with this market revolution, there are a lot of social effects as well. One includes international migrants. So immigrants came to the US in the 1830s and 40s, mostly from Germany and Ireland. Many would work in factories in big cities. Others would start new communities in the Midwest. Manufacturing will lead to increased standard of living. Families, you don't have to worry about producing everything for your family. Now you can go and buy stuff from a general store. However, this does lead to large amounts of poor laborers working in unskilled jobs. Something I just kind of said before is this next point, that you don't have to farm for yourself. That's semi-subsistence farming. Now they can produce goods for a business and buy products from someone else. They don't need to grow all their food anymore. They can buy that. Another change is the change of gender and family roles. Before this time period, when men worked at the home. Women were much more a part of business deals and a part of decision making. When men go off to work in these factories and in these businesses outside the home, it really creates this separated sphere between men and women, that men should be off working outside the home and women should be taking care of the home. This leads to things like Republican motherhood, where women take care of the house and family. For expanding democracy, there's a lot of different ways that the government expanded its ability for different people to have political power. One example of this is where states are requiring property requirements in order to vote, which eventually changed to all white men can vote regardless of property. So this still means that women, people of color cannot vote. This is one of the first shifts towards opening political power to more people. With this, people like President Jackson uses mass politics as a strategy. That could be marches, mass meetings. We'll see later the log cabin, hard cider, basically trying to portray yourself as the common man. Trying to argue things like National Bank is against the common man. So politicians would try to portray themselves as, I am defending the common man, when oftentimes they weren't a part of that world. So similar to the fights between Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, the Democrats and the Whigs will disagree on pretty much all of their policies. For the Democrats, they will be against the banks, tariffs, and internal improvements. Whereas the Whigs are for banks, tariffs, and internal improvements. People living in the South and on the frontier generally agree with the Whigs, the banks, tariffs, internal improvements never really helped the people out in the frontier. And then we talked about American Indian removal in a previous bullet point. For the development of American culture, there's a couple things like there's new literature. Really, the only thing we want you to focus on is maybe transcendentalism. Did not spell that right. Which basically means that people can gain a higher understanding of life by observing nature. With increased participation and agency in politics, more Americans are beginning to find a desire to have more agency in other aspects of their life. For instance, religion. With more democratic and individualistic beliefs, more people are rejoining churches that more closely resemble what they believe. So part of the the second great awakening are different social aspects, depending on what you believed about Jesus or baptism. Sometimes churches would even split based on slavery. Second Great Awakening is also going to lead to new social changes, people desiring to find new changes to things like political reform, prison reform, fighting for abolition of slavery. Leads us to the Age of Reform. In some cases, the Age of Reform led to the idea that people could leave to religious movements or utopian societies, where oftentimes people would live in social communes away from other communities. Usually these would not last very long. Americans would form new voluntary organizations. This could be something like being against alcohol, or people who supported getting rid of slavery, like William Lloyd Garrison. Many northern states codify in law outlying slavery, which leads to a free population of blacks in the North, but still restricted what rights they had. This leads to more anti-slavery movements in the North. Some would be started by white Americans in the North and would push for ideas like colonization, which is basically that African Americans would move back to African countries like Liberia. Many of these communities would not have support from actual African Americans, however. Many African American leaders, like eventually in the late 1840s and 50s, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth would condemn the colonization movements because they are Americans. They have every right to be here. This is where they were born. This is the language they speak. And so the rule of law needs to change to reflect that the government needs to treat them equal and that various laws uphold white supremacy throughout the country. Women's rights movement is really launched with the Seneca Falls Convention, where women demand the right to vote and other political power. For African Americans during this time, we had talked about the anti-slavery movement in the North, efforts in the South. In the early 1800s was mostly slave rebellions. But after slave rebellions in places like Haiti, the southern state governments made several laws that would make it more difficult for African Americans to organize, to plan rebellions, like not allowing enslaved people to learn to read or write, or to shoot a gun, or if they left a property, they had to have a pass. Slave rebellions did occur, where people did organize against all odds, but were largely unsuccessful. People of color did create their own communities, many of which were surrounded by the Black church, where white governments, white plantation owners gave pretty much free range for African Americans to meet and organize on Sundays. So in the South is controlled by the planter elites. They own most of the slaves. They might own 200 plus enslaved people. Most people living in the South, largest demographic, are white small farmers who own 0 enslaved people. The South is still going to rely on cotton and other cash crops. So this agriculture is going to dominate political decisions in the South. However, because so many plantations have destroyed farmable land or arable land, many plantations had to move further west. And these plantations, especially in Alabama, in Mississippi, would develop much harsher plantation life for enslaved people living there. And that's going to be it for the Period 4 review video. If you have any questions, please see your teacher. Thank you.